On a windswept plain long ago, in a land caught between empires, the soil remembers blood. The earth of Armenia still holds the echo of hooves, the crash of armored men, and the thunder of war elephants that once shook its valleys. In the midst of that carnage, a single image stands in defiance of time. A fallen general, his lifeless hand clutching a wooden cross, his body broken yet unyielding. And behind this vision, half seen in the mists of memory, lingers another figure, veiled and silent, whose presence few chronicles preserved. She was not on the battlefield, yet she was everywhere in its meaning. She did not raise a sword, yet without her, the sword would have had no cause. Her name was Sahakanuysh, the wife of Vardan Mamikonian. And though history remembers her only in passing, her life was the hidden architecture of a nation's survival. To understand Armenia in the 5th century is to enter a world of paradox. This was a kingdom abolished and yet unextinguished, a people pressed between two imperial colossi, Byzantium to the west and Persia to the east. It was a land of mountain fortresses and monastic libraries, where noble families guarded both their ancestral honor and their fragile faith. In this crucible of power and survival, women of noble blood were more than companions. They were the unspoken alliances that tied clans together, the unseen keepers of continuity when swords failed. Sahakanuysh was born into such a family, the House of Sahak, where faith in the new Christian order had fused with the ancient prestige of the Armenian nobility. From childhood, she was steeped in the rhythms of the church. She heard the chants of liturgy in a language still young, shaped by Mesrop Mashtat's alphabet that would give Armenia its literary soul. She grew up in the echo of prayers that bound her people to an identity stronger than the shifting frontiers of empires. While boys trained with spear and bow, girls of her rank learned a quieter discipline, the art of memory, the subtle craft of holding lineages together, the unflinching endurance of faith. By the time she came of age, the fragile autonomy of Armenia had already collapsed. The monarchy had been dissolved by Persia in 428, and the land was ruled by a Marspan, appointed from Ctesiphon. To many, the future looked like assimilation, slow and irreversible. Her marriage to Vardan Mamikonian was more than a union of two individuals. It was a weaving together of two lines that bore the weight of Armenia's destiny: the sword of the Mamikonian Sparapet, hereditary commanders of the army, and the spiritual authority of Sahak's lineage, entwined with the church. In Sahakanuysh's person, faith and power, cross and sword, found their meeting place. For Vardan, she was more than a wife. She was a link to the conscience of the nation, a reminder that war was never simply about territory, but about the unseen covenant of belief. For Sahakanuysh, the marriage was both a duty and a calling. She stepped into a household where decisions were not personal, but historical, where each whisper of counsel carried the weight of thousands of lives. Armenia's nobles lived in fortresses perched on ridges, with courtyards echoing the sounds of training soldiers and priests copying manuscripts. In such halls, Sahakanuysh managed her household with quiet authority. She supervised the education of servants and children alike, ensuring that even the youngest learned to read the sacred letters, to cross themselves in defiance of Zoroastrian decrees. In evenings lit by oil lamps, she listened to the weary voice of her husband recounting negotiations with Persian envoys and Byzantine diplomats. She did not speak in councils, but her presence shaped his resolve. She knew that men carried battles on their shoulders, but women carried futures in silence. Her world was one of contradictions. By custom, she was confined within domestic walls, yet those walls were themselves the last redoubt of a threatened civilization. She lived under Persian sovereignty, yet the rhythm of her days was marked by Christian ritual that the Shah's decrees could not erase. She was expected to serve, yet her influence was such that even the Catholicos sought her counsel through the women's networks of noble households. In her life, power took a hidden form, one that left no chronicles but shaped the very atmosphere of resistance. The years before the Great Revolt were years of tightening chains. When Yazdegerd Tooth issued his decree that Armenians must abandon Christianity for Zoroastrianism, fear spread like winter frost. Nobles wavered, priests trembled, and some betrayed. In this climate, Sahakanuysh's role grew heavier. Within her home, she gathered the women of her family, instructing them never to yield in faith. She became the custodian of whispers, secret prayers, clandestine baptisms, and the teaching of scripture to children who could no longer learn it openly. Her house was not only a dwelling, it was a sanctuary. For Vardan, the pressure of empire pressed from every side. Persian officials offered him rank and wealth if only he would bow to the fire altars. Byzantine emissaries dangled promises of aid that never came. In these moments of torment, the figure he returned to was not the emperor nor the patriarch, but his wife. When he faltered, she reminded him with simple words that faith without sacrifice is only a shadow, and that the honor of Armenia would not survive another generation of compromise. Her conviction, born not of battlefield pride, but of the endurance of mothers, reinforced his wavering strength. The chronicles never record her speeches, yet they record his decisions, and through him, we see her shadow. Vardan chose the path of rebellion, a course that risked annihilation for the chance of eternal identity. He did so not alone, but bound to the invisible voice of Sahakanuysh that resonated in the silence between words. The world remembers him as the commander who led 60,000 men to face 200,000 Persians with elephants. But before that battlefield ever came, the decision was forged in quiet chambers, in whispered prayers, in the gaze of a woman who would not surrender her faith. Part one of this story is not about war, but about origin. It is about a woman who understood that survival was not measured by victory or defeat, but by the preservation of meaning. She stood at the crossroads of empires, unseen by generals, unheard by scribes, yet she held in her hands the future of a people. When we recall Vardan's defiance, we must remember that his courage was sharpened by the steel of her belief. For behind every sword that history celebrates, there is often a hidden flame, and without that flame, the blade would have turned to ash long before it struck the field of battle. Marriage in Armenia during the 5th century was never simply a union of hearts. It was the weaving together of lineages, the merging of destinies, the sealing of fragile alliances in a land where politics and survival were inseparable. When Sahakanuysh entered the household of Vardan Mamikonian, she stepped into a bond that would outlive both of them. To the outside world, it was the joining of two noble lines. But within the silent walls of their home, it was a partnership forged in fire, tempered by faith and destined to shape the story of a nation. The Mamikonian family carried centuries of duty. They were not kings, yet they were the sword arm of Armenia, hereditary commanders whose loyalty to the realm was both privilege and burden. Every boy born into the clan was trained not only in the art of war, but in the knowledge that his life belonged to the nation before it belonged to himself. Sahakanuysh understood this even before her wedding. She knew that her husband's path would lead him into councils, intrigues, and battlefields. What she could not yet know was how closely her own fate would be bound to those struggles, how her household would become both sanctuary and fortress, and how the children she bore would inherit not peace, but the heavy mantle of unfinished war. From the first days of their union, the rhythm of their marriage was unlike that of ordinary couples. Vardan was often absent, sent on diplomatic missions or overseeing military preparations, for the Persians demanded service, and the Byzantines lured with promises. Yet in those absences, the core of their marriage took shape. Sahakanuysh became the steward of memory and order within the Mamikonian estate. She presided over the education of their children and retainers, teaching them to pray, to read in the newly shaped Armenian alphabet, to see themselves as part of a people chosen to suffer and endure. In her calm guidance, the faith of the household was not merely preserved, it was sharpened like a hidden blade. Theirs was not a marriage of romance in the modern sense, but of deep respect and solemn duty. Sahakanuysh's nobility of birth and her piety created a counterbalance to the worldly pressures that bore down on Vardan. He returned from councils with Persian satraps, heavy with the knowledge of impossible choices, and found in her the steady gaze that reminded him of what truly mattered. She was a mirror in which he saw not his doubts but his destiny. In the glow of oil lamps and the hush of night, she restored his strength with words that the chronicles never wrote, but whose echoes can still be traced in the decisions he made. Their home became a living emblem of Armenian resilience. The halls were filled with the clamor of soldiers preparing for campaigns, but just as often with the quiet murmur of priests reciting prayers, scribes copying sacred texts, and children repeating verses of scripture. To visitors, the estate seemed like any other noble household, but those who lingered sensed something different, a unity of sword and cross, of power and piety. That unity was embodied in the partnership of Vardan and Sahakanuysh. She transformed the domestic sphere into a fortress of faith while he prepared to defend that faith with the armies of the realm. The years after their marriage were years of mounting tension. Armenia's nobles lived under the suffocating shadow of Persia. The Shah demanded loyalty, not merely in politics but in religion. To be Armenian meant to be Christian, and to abandon Christianity meant to unravel the very identity of the nation. When Yazdegerd Tooth ascended the Persian throne, the pressure became unbearable. Decrees came demanding that nobles abandon the cross for the fire altars of Zoroastrianism. Many wavered. Some whispered that compromise was the only path to survival. Yet in the Mamikonian household, compromise was never an option. It was in these years that Sahakanuysh's role as wife and mother deepened into something larger. She became the invisible bulwark against despair. She gathered the women of the household, teaching them to pass on prayers in secret, to baptize children quietly in basins of water, to keep alive the rituals that the Persians sought to stamp out. In doing so, she ensured that even if soldiers fell and churches were burned, the faith would survive in kitchens and nurseries, in whispered hymns that no empire could silence. Her marriage to Vardan was thus a covenant of resistance. Their children grew not in innocence but in the shadow of looming conflict. Sahakanuysh taught them the dual inheritance of their blood, the sword from their father's line, the cross from hers. She knew that their future would not be safe, but she ensured it would be anchored. Every story she told, every prayer she taught, was a seed planted against the drought of persecution. Beyond the household, the marriage itself had political weight. Other noble families looked to the union of Sahakanuysh and Vardan as a symbol of continuity. When quarrels broke out among Nakarars, when loyalties wavered between Byzantium and Persia, the Mamikonian couple stood as proof that faith and duty could be joined, that resistance was possible. The church itself took encouragement from the alliance, seeing in Sahakanuysh a daughter of its lineage who now stood at the heart of Armenia's military command. The bond between them was tested repeatedly by absence and danger. Vardan was dispatched to Constantinople to lead Armenian contingents in service of the Byzantine emperor. There he was honored, flattered, drawn into the dazzling world of Roman ceremony. But even in the glitter of imperial courts, his thoughts returned to the austere halls of his homeland, where Sahakanuysh guarded both his children and his conscience. Letters were scarce and perilous, yet the memory of her constancy kept him from yielding too much to the seductions of foreign power. When he returned, the reunion was not one of passion, but of renewed resolve. Together, they understood more clearly than ever that their marriage was not merely for themselves, but for the people whose fate rested on their choices. The fires of Persia burned ever closer. Envoys pressed the nobles to renounce their faith. Bribes were offered, threats were sharpened, and more than a few gave in. Yet within the Mamikonian halls, the atmosphere remained unyielding. Sahakanuysh ensured that no child in her household bowed to the fire. She instilled in them a sense of destiny, a belief that their lives were part of a greater narrative. Even the servants, inspired by her devotion, carried that defiance into the villages. Quietly, invisibly, the spirit of rebellion spread, carried by the endurance of women who refused to betray the cross. The marriage of Vardan and Sahakanuysh was thus not a private matter, but a public testimony. It was a beacon to others, a sign that unity was possible amid division. Every feast they hosted, every baptism they sponsored, every prayer they led in their halls was a declaration that Armenia would not bow. The Persians could command armies, but they could not command the bond of husband and wife, forged in fire, sealed by faith, and guarded by love that was larger than desire. In the silence of nights when Vardan prepared for war, Sahakanuysh prepared for legacy. She knew that history often remembered only the men who fell in battle, yet she also knew that without the women who sustained them, those men would never have stood. Her marriage was her battlefield, her household her garrison, her children her soldiers of memory. In the union of her life with Vardan's, Armenia found a model of resilience that no empire could erase. And so the marriage that began as a political alliance grew into something deeper, a partnership that embodied the paradox of Armenia itself, fragile yet unbreakable, vulnerable yet eternal. In the years to come, when swords clashed and blood flowed, the meaning of that union would be tested in fire and consecrated in sacrifice. But even in the early days, it was clear. This was no ordinary marriage. It was the seed of defiance, the root of survival, the hidden strength behind the sword that history would remember. The fate of Armenia in the 5th century was to exist in the twilight between two worlds, caught in the long shadow cast by empires. To the west lay Byzantium, the Christian colossus that claimed spiritual kinship yet demanded obedience. To the east stretched Persia, the fire-worshipping Sasanian realm that demanded not only tribute but conversion. In that fragile space between cross and flame, Vardan Mamikonian shouldered the burden of command, but it was Sahakanuysh who bore the quieter weight of endurance. Her life was not lived in councils or on battlefields, but in the margins where decisions turned into consequences, where households became microcosms of a nation's struggle. She lived beneath the shadow of empires, yet within her heart she carried a light that empires could not extinguish. The geography of Armenia itself mirrored the precariousness of its people. High mountains carved valleys of isolation, fortresses crowned ridges, monasteries clung to cliffsides like watchtowers of faith. Every pass and gorge whispered the history of armies that had marched through: Roman legions, Parthian cavalry, Persian satraps, Byzantine generals. The land had no illusions about permanence. It endured by adaptation, by resilience, by the stubborn determination of its people to outlast conquerors. Sahakanuysh, raised in the lineage of Sahak and bound to the Mamikonian clan, embodied that determination in a form less visible, but no less decisive. Her household became a reflection of the broader tension. By law and by decree, the Persian Marspon ruled over Armenia. Governors in Ctesiphon sent orders demanding conformity, taxation, and loyalty. The Persian nobility looked upon Armenia as a province to be absorbed fully into the fabric of the Sasanian state. Yet within the homes of noble families like that of Sahakanuysh, another sovereignty reigned. The cross hung on walls, the Gospels were read aloud, the feasts were marked by Christian ritual rather than Zoroastrian fire sacrifices. To those who entered, the message was unmistakable. Though the empire claimed the land, it could not claim the soul. It was in these years that Sahakanuysh's influence deepened beyond the boundaries of her estate. Noble women were rarely chronicled, but they were the weavers of alliances and the keepers of continuity. When men met in councils and debated strategy, the women built the networks of kinship that held the aristocracy together. Through feasts, marriages, and the education of children, Sahakanuysh strengthened bonds among families wavering between loyalty to Persia and fidelity to the church. She was not a politician in the formal sense, but her presence reminded others of what was at stake. In every gathering, her quiet piety and noble bearing were a rebuke to compromise, an unspoken sermon that faith was not to be bartered away. For Vardan, the pressure of empires was relentless. Byzantium beckoned with promises of aid, but its emperors were fickle, their attention always shifting toward their own endless wars. Persia demanded obedience and punished resistance with exile, torture, or execution. The nobles of Armenia were pulled in both directions, tempted by bribes, cowed by threats, confused by the shifting balance of power. In this maelstrom, Vardan often returned home weary, carrying the invisible scars of compromise and frustration. Sahakanuysh received him not with complaint, but with the steadiness of someone who understood that his battle was not only external, but internal. She knew that the greater danger was not defeat on the field, but surrender in the heart. Her influence was subtle, rarely recorded, yet profound. While scribes chronicled the decrees of kings and the speeches of generals, it was the quiet endurance of women like her that anchored the identity of a people. She oversaw the education of her children with an intensity that made every lesson an act of resistance. When the empire sought to erase the gospel, she doubled its presence in her home. When officials demanded fire altars, she lit candles before the cross. When fear spread through villages, she offered sanctuary, reminding the frightened that their suffering was not meaningless, but part of a greater narrative stretching from Golgotha to their own mountains. The empire's shadow fell heavily on every household. Spies reported disobedience, Persian soldiers patrolled villages, and nobles suspected of disloyalty were summoned to Ctesiphon. Many never returned, yet even under this pressure, Sahakanuysh refused to let fear define her. She transformed her household into a refuge for priests fleeing persecution, scribes who risked their lives to copy manuscripts, and orphans left behind when their parents were martyred. The Mamikonian estate became more than a noble residence. It became a bastion of identity, a place where Armenia's soul was guarded against the encroaching fire. Her marriage to Vardan, already a bond of faith and duty, deepened under these trials. He saw in her not merely a wife, but a living symbol of what he fought for. She represented continuity, the quiet strength of Armenia's women who would outlast the clamor of empires. When he faltered, she steadied him. When he raged against betrayal, she reminded him of patience. When despair threatened to crush him, she offered a perspective rooted in eternity rather than the fleeting power of kings. Together, they embodied the paradox of their people, militarily vulnerable yet spiritually unbreakable, politically divided yet united in identity. The world around them grew darker. Envoys from Persia arrived with ultimatums. Some nobles bent the knee, swearing fealty not only to the Shah but to his gods. Others plotted rebellion, whispering of alliances with Byzantium. The church itself trembled, with bishops caught between survival and martyrdom. In this climate, the role of Sahakanuysh became even more vital. She was the guardian of the household's conscience, ensuring that her children and servants never mistook compromise for victory. She taught them that true defeat came not with chains or exile, but with the surrender of the soul. The shadow of empires loomed larger with each passing year, but within that darkness, Sahakanuysh nurtured a flame. It was not the blaze of battle or the spectacle of politics, but the steady light of conviction. While generals and kings plotted, she kept alive the quiet rituals that bound a people to their God. The empires might dominate the maps, redraw borders, and claim victories, but they could not dominate the human heart. In her silent strength, Sahakanuysh proved that the true battlefield was not only on the plains of Avarayr, but also within the walls of every home, in the soul of every child, in the faith of every woman who refused to bow. The story of Armenia in the 5th century is often told as a tale of battles and treaties, of nobles and shahs. Yet beneath those chronicles lies the deeper truth, that survival was made possible by those who bore the empire's shadow without surrendering to it. Sahakanuysh was one of those silent pillars, and though history barely whispers her name, her influence resounds in the very survival of her people's faith. She lived not in the light of recognition, but in the shadow of empires, and it was in that shadow that she preserved a light bright enough to outlast centuries. The decree came like a thunderclap across the mountains, a royal command issued from the throne of Yazdegerd Tooth, Shahanshah of Persia, carried on parchment and sealed with fire. It declared that the people of Armenia, those stubborn Christians on the empire's western flank, must abandon the faith of the cross and embrace the worship of fire. It was not only a religious demand, it was a political ultimatum, a test of obedience, a way to erase the difference that set Armenia apart from the other provinces of the Sasanian world. To the Shah, uniformity meant strength. To the Armenians, it meant death of the soul. When the decree was read aloud in noble courts and village squares, fear swept through the land. Some bowed their heads and whispered assent, reasoning that survival was worth more than ritual. Others recoiled in silence, torn between loyalty to Persia and loyalty to Christ. In the halls of the Mamikonian household, the words of the decree fell heavy, but not unexpected. Vardan knew this day would come, and so did Sahakanuysh. For years the pressure had mounted, but now it had crystallized into a demand that could not be evaded. The empire had spoken, and the line had been drawn. Sahakanuysh felt the weight of this moment in her bones. She knew that the choice before them was more than political maneuvering. It was a question of identity. She gathered the women of the household, instructing them that under no circumstances were they to bend to the fire altars. She taught them that faith is not tested in prosperity, but in the crucible of threat. To the young children, she spoke of the martyrs of old, of those who had died rather than deny the cross. In whispers by lamplight, she prepared their hearts for the storm to come. Meanwhile, Vardan wrestled with the impossible task of leadership. The nobles were divided. Some urged compliance, arguing that conversion could be symbolic, a gesture to appease the Shah while privately maintaining Christian rituals. Others counseled outright rebellion, claiming that death was preferable to submission. Still others plotted for their own advantage, hoping to rise in favor by betraying their compatriots. Vardan stood at the center of this storm, torn between pragmatism and conviction. In those moments of doubt, it was Sahakanuysh who anchored him. Her words, never recorded in chronicles, carried more weight than decrees. She reminded him that compromise in matters of faith was not diplomacy, but surrender. She reminded him that their children's souls were at stake, that the story of Armenia would not be written in treaties but in sacrifice. The whispers of revolt began not in battlefields but in kitchens, courtyards, and monasteries. Priests whispered prayers of defiance. Mothers whispered hymns to their children. Nobles whispered plans of resistance behind closed doors. Sahakanuysh became a central figure in this underground current. Her estate turned into a gathering place where priests found refuge, where scribes copied the Gospels in haste before soldiers might arrive to confiscate them, where widows and orphans came seeking shelter. Her presence radiated a kind of calm defiance, not loud or theatrical, but steady, like a mountain that cannot be moved. The Persians were not blind to the undercurrents of resistance. They summoned nobles to Ctesiphon, demanding public oaths and conversions. Many were forced to bow at fire altars, their lips reciting prayers to Ahura Mazda, while their hearts remained elsewhere. Vardan himself was compelled to make such gestures under duress, a compromise that gnawed at his soul. He returned home in torment, feeling he had betrayed not only his faith, but his people. It was Sahakanuysh who confronted his despair, who refused to let his moment of weakness define him. She told him that the true test was not in a coerced gesture before a tyrant, but in the choices he made freely for his people. It was her resilience that restored his courage and transformed his shame into renewed determination. As whispers spread, so did rumors of alliances. Some nobles reached out to Byzantium, hoping the emperor would send aid. Others sought to rally tribes from the north, desperate for reinforcements against the might of Persia. Vardan took part in these efforts, but he knew that external help was uncertain. The true strength of Armenia lay not in foreign armies, but in the unyielding will of its own people. That will was embodied most vividly in the women who refused to surrender their faith. Sahakanuysh became a symbol of that unbroken will. She stood as a living rebuke to those who argued that submission was the only path to survival. The church, too, found renewed courage in this climate. Bishops and priests, inspired by the steadfastness of families like that of the Mamikonians, began to speak more boldly. They preached that martyrdom was not defeat but victory, that the blood of the faithful would water the roots of the nation. In secret gatherings, hymns rose into the night, defying the silence that Persia sought to impose. Sahakanuysh attended these gatherings, veiled among the women, her presence a reminder that faith was not only for the battlefield, but for the hearth, not only for soldiers, but for mothers and children. The whispers of revolt grew louder, turning into plans of open resistance. Vardan could no longer remain a cautious noble balancing loyalties. He began to prepare for war. In the halls of the estate, armor was polished, weapons forged, and men drilled. Yet even as the clang of steel echoed, Sahakanuysh continued her quieter labor. She organized the women to provide supplies, to preserve food, to care for the children who would soon lose fathers and brothers. She prepared her household not only for war, but for the aftermath of war, for the grief and endurance that would follow. It was in this period that her influence on the next generation became most visible. The children of the Mamikonian clan grew up watching their mothers resolve. They learned that courage was not only the charge of cavalry, but the refusal to abandon one's prayers even when threatened. They saw that true power was not in swords alone, but in the faith that gave those swords meaning. Through Sahakanuysh, they learned that survival without faith was a hollow victory, and that death with conviction was a form of triumph. By the time the nobles gathered at Artasata to declare their defiance, the die had been cast. Vardan was chosen to lead, not only because of his lineage, but because his household embodied the unity of sword and cross, of nobility and faith. Behind that choice stood Sahakanuysh, the silent architect of conviction. She did not ride into council chambers or address the assembly, yet her influence radiated through her husband's presence. He spoke with the authority of one who had been strengthened not only by history, but by the unwavering gaze of a woman who refused to bow. The whispers had become shouts, and the path ahead was clear. Armenia would rise in revolt, not for conquest, not for wealth, but for the right to remain itself. The empire had demanded submission, but the people had chosen resistance. In this crucible of decision, Sahakanuysh had done her part, unseen yet indispensable. She had prepared the ground, nurtured the faith, and steeled the resolve that would carry her husband and her people into the storm of Avarayr. The empires had spoken with fire and decree, but she had answered with whispers that refused to die, whispers that became the roar of defiance. The path toward destiny is rarely a straight line. It twists through hesitation, betrayal, and the slow gathering of resolve. For Armenia, in the year 450, the path curved inexorably toward a single field that would one day be named in blood and memory. The decree of Yazdegerd had already pushed the nobles into defiance, and the decision at Artaxata had made resistance official. Yet between decision and battle lay a long road, one paved not only with the clash of armies, but with the quiet endurance of households like that of Sahakanuysh. She became, in those months of mounting tension, the guardian of the flame that would carry her people through the darkness. Mobilization began in earnest as winter yielded to spring. Across the valleys and ridges, banners were unfurled, weapons sharpened, horses readied. Villages gave up their sons. Noble families armed their retainers. Monasteries blessed soldiers in candlelit ceremonies. But if one listened beyond the clang of steel, one could hear another sound, less martial but no less vital. The murmur of women preparing, storing grain, weaving garments, binding wounds before they were made. Sahakanuysh moved among them, her presence a quiet command. She saw that war was not only about what happened on the field, but also about whether families could survive its aftermath. In her hands, the household became a fortress of resilience, stockpiling what could be carried, preserving what could be hidden, comforting those who would soon be bereaved. Vardan rode often in those days, gathering his fellow Nakarars, trying to unify a nobility fractured by ambition and fear. Some hesitated still, fearful of Persia's overwhelming might. Others plotted privately, hoping to profit regardless of outcome. The most treacherous of all was Vasaksioni, whose loyalty shifted like sand, who spoke words of allegiance while secretly negotiating with the Persians. Vardan, though valiant, knew too well the fragility of his coalition. He returned home exhausted, bearing the bitterness of councils where betrayal lurked behind every smile. It was in those hours that Sahakanuysh's steadiness mattered most. She listened to his frustrations, absorbed his anger, and reminded him that no matter how fragile the nobility, the heart of the people was firm. She reminded him that he did not fight for faithless nobles, but for the countless peasants, priests, and mothers who had no voice in councils yet carried the soul of Armenia in their prayers. Her estate became more than a noble residence. It turned into a sanctuary. Priests fleeing harassment found shelter there. Scribes bent over manuscripts preserving the words of Scripture. Children orphaned by earlier persecutions were fed and clothed within its walls. The women of the household, guided by Sahakanuysh, spun wool into cloaks for soldiers, prepared bandages, and stored food to sustain men on campaign. In this unseen labor lay the foundation of resistance. For every soldier on the field, there were 10 unseen hands that sustained him. Sahakanuysh orchestrated those hands with quiet authority, never raising her voice, yet commanding by the sheer force of her example. The mood across Armenia oscillated between dread and fervor. Hymns were sung in secret gatherings. Prayers rose in cathedrals where incense mingled with tears. The people knew what lay ahead, an unequal battle against the might of Persia. Yet they also knew that their souls were at stake, and that truth gave them a courage beyond calculation. Sahakanuysh moved through this atmosphere with composure, neither denying the danger nor succumbing to despair. She embodied the paradox of her people, fragile in body, unbreakable in spirit. As the nobles rallied under Vardan's command, emissaries were sent to seek aid. Appeals went to Byzantium, begging for soldiers and gold. Letters were dispatched to northern tribes, offering alliances. But aid was slow, promises uncertain, and Armenia remained largely alone. This isolation could have crushed morale, but within the Mamikonian household, Sahakanuysh reframed it as a mark of destiny. She taught her children and attendants that being abandoned by allies was proof that their struggle was pure, untainted by foreign motives. She said that when the world turns its back, God listens more closely. Such words, whispered in kitchens and courtyards, carried more power than any political pledge. The closer the hour of battle approached, the more intense the preparations became. Vardan spent days drilling his men, studying the terrain, planning strategies against Persia's elephants and cavalry. He knew the odds were nearly impossible, but he also knew that hesitation would be fatal. Each time he left for councils or camps, he left behind Sahakanuysh, and in doing so left behind more than his family. He left behind the conscience of his cause. She was his tether to the reason for which he fought. Without her, his struggle might have devolved into the ambition of a general. With her, it became the devotion of a martyr. In the villages surrounding their estate, the peasants looked to her as a figure of reassurance. When rumors of Persian spies circulated, when fear spread that armies would burn their homes, she walked among them calmly, speaking words of comfort. Her presence reminded them that even in the shadow of doom, dignity remained. Mothers drew strength from her steadiness. Children felt safe under her gaze. She did not need to command armies. Her authority was of a different kind, the authority of one who refuses to let fear dictate the future. The whispers of revolt had now become open proclamations. In churches, priests declared that martyrdom was victory, that those who died would enter eternal glory. The people took these words to heart, but it was the example of women like Sahakanuysh that gave those words flesh. For when children saw their mothers refusing to abandon the cross, they understood that courage was not a masculine trait alone. When husbands returned from councils full of doubt, the unwavering faith of their wives reminded them that surrender was not an option. Thus, the revolt became not only a military campaign, but a cultural uprising, rooted in the steadfastness of both men and women. The road to Avarayr was marked not only by mobilization, but by betrayal. Reports trickled in that Vasaksuni had secretly corresponded with Persian officials, promising to weaken the Armenian side at the crucial moment. Vardan knew this yet could not sever ties, for to accuse a noble without proof would fracture the coalition entirely. He bore this knowledge like a wound, knowing he might ride into battle with traitors at his side. When he confided his fears to Sahakanuysh, she answered with the serenity of faith. She told him that betrayal was the weapon of the weak, and that no betrayal could undo the meaning of sacrifice. She told him that even if every noble abandoned him, the people would remember his stand, and that memory would outlast treachery. Her words did not erase the danger, but they transfigured it, giving him a vision beyond the immediate horizon of battle. Spring ripened into summer, and the armies of Persia began to move. Scouts reported elephants advancing, banners unfurling, the ground trembling with the march of thousands. The inevitability of confrontation settled over Armenia like a heavy cloud. Yet amid the dread, there was also a strange peace. The people knew that the die was cast, that the path ahead could no longer be diverted. In the Mamikonian estate, Sahakanuysh prepared as if for a sacred feast, ensuring that her household was ready for both loss and legacy. She instructed her children in prayers that they would remember for life. She comforted the wives of soldiers who feared widowhood. She gave strength to priests who wavered in their courage. Her every action was suffused with the sense that history itself was leaning upon her shoulders. The road to Avarayr was not only a march of armies but a pilgrimage of faith. Each step taken by Vardan and his men was accompanied by the invisible steps of women who sustained them. Each sword lifted was sharpened by the conviction forged in households like that of Sahakanuysh. She did not ride in armor, she did not hold command. Yet her influence was as real as the banners that fluttered in the wind. She represented the hidden foundation of the revolt, the conscience that made it more than a rebellion and transformed it into a holy struggle. As the final days before battle approached, Sahakanuysh watched her husband with a mixture of pride and sorrow. She knew that his path led to sacrifice, that the odds were too great, that he might never return. Yet she did not beg him to stay, nor did she allow grief to cloud her resolve. Instead, she stood as the embodiment of what he fought for: a wife, a mother, a believer who refused to surrender her soul. In her gaze, he saw not fear, but destiny, not despair, but the certainty that even in death there is victory when faith is preserved. The armies would soon meet on the plain of Avarayr, and blood would flow like rivers. But before a single arrow was loosed, before a single sword clashed, the true battle had already been won in the heart of Sahakanuysh and those like her. They had chosen faith over survival, dignity over compromise, eternity over empire. The road to Avarayr was paved with their whispers, their prayers, their defiance. It was a road that led not only to battle, but to the making of a nation's soul. The morning of battle dawned not with sunlight, but with a heavy stillness that seemed to press upon the land itself. The plain of Avarayr stretched wide, its soil damp with spring rains, its grasses bent beneath the hooves of horses gathering in formation. To the east, the banners of Persia unfurled like a dark sea, endless ranks of cavalry glinting in the pale light, war elephants shifting restlessly, their massive silhouettes blotting the horizon. To the west, the smaller Armenian host clustered around the cross-bearing standard, men drawn from valleys and fortresses, nobles armored in steel that gleamed defiantly against the overwhelming tide. The earth itself seemed to tremble in anticipation of what was to come. Far from the battlefield, in the halls of the Mamikonian estate, Sahakanuysh felt that trembling in her own body. She had not marched with the armies, but she lived every moment of their ordeal. She rose before dawn and gathered the women of the household to pray, their whispered hymns rising like incense into the still air. They prayed not for victory as much as for endurance, for the strength to meet whatever came with faith unbroken. Every sound in the distance made her pause, as if the clash of steel might carry across mountains. Though separated by miles, she was bound to her husband by an invisible cord, feeling in her heart the storm that he faced with sword in hand. On the field, Vardan rode before his men, the cross of Christ held high above the banners of the Martyrs. He knew they were outnumbered, perhaps 3 or 4 to 1. He knew the Persians possessed elephants, beasts that inspired terror even before the battle began. Yet he also knew that his men carried something the Persians could never command: the unyielding conviction that they fought not for conquest or wealth, but for the soul of their nation. The soldiers murmured prayers as they formed their lines. The priests walked among them, offering blessings, and the nobles swore oaths that they would rather die than abandon the cross. The air was thick with both fear and exultation, as if heaven itself leaned down to watch. The first clash came with a sound like thunder. Persian cavalry surged forward, their lances leveled, their war cries echoing. The Armenians met them with shields locked, spears thrusting upward. Horses screamed, men shouted, steel rang against steel. The battle unfolded with brutal intensity, dust rising to cloud the sun. In the midst of the chaos, the elephants advanced, their tusks gleaming, their trunks flailing, their massive feet crushing earth and bone alike. The ground shook beneath them, and even seasoned warriors felt dread seep into their hearts. Yet Vardan and his men did not falter. They hurled spears and arrows, hacking at the elephant's legs, pressing forward despite the overwhelming force. For every Armenian who fell, another stepped into his place, the line bending but refusing to break. Back at the estate, Sahakanuysh clutched the cross she wore around her neck, her knuckles white with tension. She had prepared herself for this day, knowing it might mean widowhood, knowing it might mean raising her children alone. Yet she also knew that Vardan did not fight merely as a husband or father, but as the embodiment of a people's defiance. She whispered prayers not only for his safety but for his soul, that if he fell, he would fall as a martyr, his sacrifice sanctified by faith. Around her, the women of the household wept quietly, some for husbands, some for brothers, some for sons. Sahakanuysh allowed the tears but refused despair. She reminded them that their grief was part of a greater offering, that their sorrow was the price of freedom for generations yet unborn. On the battlefield, the struggle raged hour after hour. The Armenians fought with ferocity that astonished their enemies, striking down cavalry, wounding elephants, holding their ground against impossible odds. Vardan himself fought in the thick of the melee, his sword flashing, his voice lifting prayers as much as commands. But courage alone could not overturn disparity. The Persians pressed relentlessly, their numbers inexhaustible, their elephants wreaking havoc among the lines. Betrayal compounded the peril as Sahakanuysh's faction faltered, leaving gaps that the enemy exploited. Slowly, inexorably, the Armenian host was pushed back, their formations broken, their soldiers cut down. Yet even in retreat, they fought with unyielding spirit, turning every withdrawal into another stand, every loss into another defiance. News traveled slowly in those days, carried by riders and rumors. Sahakanuysh waited with a heart that alternated between hope and dread, straining for any word. At last messengers arrived, their faces grim, their voices heavy. They spoke of courage beyond measure, of Persians slain in droves, of elephants wounded, of the enemy shocked by the ferocity of Armenian resistance. But they also spoke of overwhelming numbers, of betrayal, of the final collapse. And then came the words she had both feared and expected. Vardan Mamikonian had fallen, struck down in the fury of battle, his body broken, but his cross still clutched in his hand. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The walls of the estate blurred, the voices around her faded. Sahakanuysh felt the weight of widowhood descend like a cloak of stone. Yet even in that moment of shattering loss, she did not wail or collapse. She bowed her head and allowed the tears to fall silently, but within her heart burned a strange and solemn peace. She had known this day would come, and she had prepared for it not with denial, but with conviction. Vardan had not died in vain. His blood was not spilled as defeat, but as testimony. The Persians might claim the field, but the Armenians had claimed eternity. In the days that followed, grief swept across Armenia like a tide. Thousands of families mourned their dead, villages wept for sons who would never return. The land itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of loss. Yet amid the sorrow there was also pride. The people spoke of Avarayr not as annihilation, but as consecration. They told stories of Vardan and his warriors who fought against impossible odds, of priests who blessed the dying, of nobles who refused to surrender. They remembered that even in death, their leaders had preserved the soul of the nation. And behind those stories stood Sahakanuysh, widow of the fallen general, custodian of his legacy. She gathered her children and spoke to them not of despair, but of destiny. She told them that their father had died not as a defeated soldier, but as a victorious martyr, that his name would be remembered long after the Persians who slew him were forgotten. She told them that they carried his blood and his faith, and that their task was to live in such a way that his sacrifice would not be wasted. In her strength, the household found resilience. In her composure, the people found inspiration. She became the living embodiment of Armenia's paradox, broken yet unbroken, bereaved yet unyielding, defeated in body yet triumphant in spirit. The day the earth trembled at Avarayr was a day of blood and loss, but it was also the day Armenia was reborn. Out of the smoke of battle emerged not only martyrs, but a myth, a story that would sustain the nation for centuries. And at the heart of that story was Sahakanuysh, the woman who bore the weight of sacrifice, who transformed grief into endurance, who kept alive the flame that no empire could extinguish. She had not wielded a sword, yet she had shaped the meaning of every sword that fell. She had not stood on the battlefield, yet she had lived through every blow. The earth trembled that day, but the faith of Armenia stood firm, carried in the heart of a widow who refused to let despair have the final word. The news of Avarayr spread like a wound across the valleys and ridges of Armenia. Smoke still hung over the plain, where thousands had fallen, but already messengers rode from village to village, telling of the clash, the bravery, the slaughter, and the death of Vardan Mamikonian. In every household, grief took its place at the table. Grief for fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands who would never return. but none carried the weight of sorrow more heavily than Sahakanuysh. She had become a widow not only of a man, but of a legend, the custodian of a memory that belonged to an entire people. Her mourning was not a private matter. When Vardan fell, he became more than her husband. He became the symbol of a nation's defiance, the martyr whose blood sanctified the soil. To the Armenians, his death was both wound and rallying cry. And to Sahakanuysh, that meant her grief could never be solitary. She wept, yes, but always in the presence of others, always with eyes upon her, always as a figure not only of sorrow, but of endurance. Her tears were seen as the tears of Armenia itself, and her silence as the silence of a nation learning to live with loss. The estate of the Mamikonians became a place of pilgrimage. Widows came to share their grief, orphans to seek comfort, priests to offer blessings. They looked to Sahakanuysh as if she embodied the very spirit of Vardan's sacrifice. She did not disappoint them. Though her heart was broken, she refused to let despair consume her. She clothed herself in black, yes, but she walked with dignity, her head unbowed, her voice steady. She spoke of her husband not as one lost, but as one transfigured, not as a man cut down, but as a martyr risen into eternity. Her composure gave courage to others. Her faith gave shape to the narrative of Avarayr. Within her household, she became both mother and father to her children. She taught them not to remember only the man who had been their protector, but to remember the meaning of his sacrifice. At night, she told them stories of their father's courage, of his refusal to bend, of the prayers he whispered even as he fought. She showed them how to cross themselves with solemnity, how to recite the Psalms, how to hold fast to their faith even if all the world turned against them. In her presence, they felt not only love, but duty, a sense that they carried within their blood the memory of a man who had died for all Armenia. Her widowhood was not one of withdrawal, but of stewardship. She oversaw the preservation of manuscripts, the protection of fugitives, the care of the wounded who returned from the battle. She ensured that the story of Avarayr was not forgotten in the chaos of survival. She listened to the testimonies of those who had fought beside Vardan, recording in her memory their accounts of his bravery, his prayers, his final stand. She wove these fragments together into a narrative that could be passed on, shaping the legend that would inspire generations. Yet even as she became a figure of strength, she was not immune to moments of piercing sorrow. There were nights when the halls of the estate felt unbearably empty, when the sound of wind against the stone walls reminded her of the silence her husband had left behind. There were mornings when she awoke expecting to hear his voice, only to be pierced again by the reality of his absence. But she bore these sorrows as part of her duty, never allowing them to overwhelm the face she showed to others. Her private grief became the foundation of her public resilience, her tears the unseen roots of her strength. The Persians, though victorious on the field, knew they had not broken Armenia's spirit. They increased their pressure, stationing garrisons, demanding obedience, punishing resistance. Yet they could not stamp out the story of Avarayr, for it had already become larger than a battle. It had become a myth, and Sahakanuysh was one of its chief guardians. She told the story in ways subtle and profound, in the way she instructed her children, in the way she spoke to the wives of fallen soldiers, in the way she prayed in churches still scarred by fire. Each act was a declaration that the cause had not died with Vardan, that the faith he defended was still alive. Her role in the years following the battle was less visible to chroniclers, but no less vital. When nobles argued over how to respond to Persian pressure, it was the memory of Vardan, preserved and embodied by his widow, that kept them from surrender. When priests faltered in their courage, it was her presence in their congregations that reminded them of the cost of faith. When children asked why their fathers had died, it was Sahakanuysh who gave the answer, framing loss not as senseless but as sacrifice. In this way, she became the living bridge between the past and the future, between martyrdom and perseverance. Her widowhood bound her in chains of memory, but those chains were also her strength. She carried the memory of Vardan not as a weight that crushed her, but as a standard she raised high. She refused to remarry, dedicating herself wholly to the legacy of her husband and the upbringing of their children. She accepted her loneliness as the price of her vocation. In doing so, she became a kind of living martyr, not slain in battle, but crucified daily by grief and transformed daily by faith. In time, the seeds she nurtured began to bear fruit. Vardan's nephew, Vardan Mamikonian, grew under the influence of the family's women, especially Sahakanuysh, who taught him the meaning of sacrifice and the necessity of endurance. He absorbed not only the memory of his uncle's heroism, but also the quiet strength of his aunt's widowhood. When his time came to lead, it was her voice echoing in his conscience, her example shaping his resolve. The victory that would come decades later, when Persia finally conceded the right of Armenians to worship freely, owed as much to her silent guardianship as to any sword drawn on the battlefield. Thus, Sahakanuysh lived her widowhood not as an end, but as a mission. She transformed grief into resilience, sorrow into memory, widowhood into leadership. She bore the chains of memory willingly, knowing that in them lay the freedom of her people. History rarely records the names of such women, but their influence endures in ways more profound than chronicles can capture. She was the widow of Vardan, but more than that, she was the mother of Armenia's endurance, the keeper of its faith, the silent architect of its survival. And so, in the years after Avarayr, when Armenia staggered beneath the weight of defeat yet refused to collapse, it was because of women like Sahakanuysh. She lived on in the shadows of memory, unseen by empires, uncelebrated by scribes, yet essential to the survival of her people. She carried her chains with dignity, and in those chains lay the strength of a nation that would not die. Time in Armenia after Avarayr was measured not in seasons, but in wounds. The land carried the scars of battle, villages still smoldered from Persian reprisal, and families carried absences at their tables that no feast could fill. Yet amid the silence of mourning, a quieter labor began, one less visible than war, but just as decisive. The labor of preserving memory, of passing on conviction to those too young to have stood on the field. In this task, no figure loomed larger than Sahakanuysh. She had lost a husband, but she refused to lose a future. She understood that while men die in battles, nations live in memory, and it was her vocation to tend that memory like a flame. The children of Armenia grew up in the shadow of loss. They heard whispers of fathers who had died at Avarayr, uncles who had vanished into captivity, brothers who had never returned from conscription. Their mothers and aunts became their teachers, weaving the story of defiance into lullabies and prayers. In this tapestry of memory, Sahakanuysh stood at the center, both as widow of the martyr general and as matriarch of the Mamikonian line. She gathered the younger members of her family, especially her husband's nephew, Vardan, and shaped their souls with the same steady hand that had steadied Vardan in his darkest hours. Vardan was a boy when Avarayr was fought, too young to ride in the ranks, but old enough to absorb the atmosphere of sacrifice. He looked to his aunt with reverence, seeing in her both sorrow and strength. She told him stories not only of Vardan's courage, but of the reasons behind it, the decree that demanded apostasy, the choice between empire and faith, the betrayal that deepened the cost of defiance. She taught him that his uncle had not died in defeat but in witness, that his blood was not spilled in vain, but planted in the soil of Armenia as seed for a future harvest. She placed upon his shoulders, gently yet firmly, the mantle of continuity. In her household, every act became instruction. When she prayed, she showed him that faith endures beyond despair. When she taught children to read in the alphabet recently forged by Mesrup Mashtats, she showed that language itself was a weapon stronger than swords. When she comforted widows, she demonstrated that leadership is not only command, but compassion. In her weaving, her fasting, her worship, she offered a living curriculum in resilience. Vardan absorbed it all, his young heart hardening not into bitterness, but into resolve. Persian authority remained heavy in those years. Governors demanded tribute, soldiers enforced decrees, informants whispered about disobedience. Yet despite the surveillance, Sahakanuysh continued her quiet defiance. She ensured that the liturgy was sung in her halls, that baptisms were performed in secret, that the Gospels were read aloud even if it meant danger. She understood that every ritual preserved was an act of rebellion, every hymn a declaration that Armenia still belonged to Christ. These practices left an indelible mark on the children, shaping them into a generation for whom faith and identity were inseparable. For Vahan, the presence of his aunt was formative. He saw in her not the fragility of widowhood, but the power of stewardship. She taught him that leadership was not a choice but a calling, one he could not evade. She did not shield him from the weight of his uncle's legacy. She pressed it upon him, not as a burden, but as a torch. She made him recite the names of those who had fallen, so that their memory would never be lost. She told him again and again that the blood shed at Avarayr demanded not despair, but continuation. In her eyes, he saw the expectation that one day he would finish what Vardan had begun. Beyond her family, Sahakanuysh extended her influence to the wider noble network. Other widows came to her for counsel. Other mothers sent their children to learn in her household. She became the quiet matriarch not only of her clan, but of a broader circle of resistance. Without ever holding a title, she exercised authority through presence, through the unspoken recognition that she embodied the endurance of Armenia itself. Nobles who wavered in their loyalty felt ashamed in her company, as if her steady gaze exposed their hesitation. Priests who faltered in courage found strength in her prayers. Ordinary villagers who heard her name took comfort in the thought that someone still carried Vardan's memory with unbroken dignity. The years passed, and Vahan grew into manhood under her watchful care. The Persia he inherited was still powerful, still determined to mold Armenia into conformity. But the Armenia he carried in his heart was the one his aunt had shaped, a nation that refused to yield, a people who measured victory not in conquest but in the preservation of faith. He remembered the whispers of his childhood, the prayers of his aunt, the tears she shed in private yet turned into resolve in public. He carried these memories as armor against despair, preparing him for the day when he would rise to lead. Sahakanuysh's later years were marked by both weariness and fulfillment. She had carried grief for decades, yet she had also carried purpose. She saw the seeds she planted take root in her children and in her nephew. She saw the story of Avarayr retold not as tragedy, but as testimony, shaping the consciousness of her people. Though the Persians continued to dominate politically, they could not dominate memory, and it was memory that determined identity. She knew then that her labor had not been in vain. The torch of resistance had passed from her husband to her, and from her to the next generation. She had not swung a sword or commanded an army, yet her influence shaped the battlefield of the future. When, years later, Vardan Mamikonian rose to lead another revolt and finally secured from Persia the recognition of Armenia's right to worship freely, it was the culmination of seeds sown in her household. She did not live to see the treaty signed, or perhaps she did in her later years, depending on the uncertain details of history. But whether present in body or only in legacy, her influence was unmistakable. The victory of 484 bore her imprint as much as Vardan's blood. Her life thus became a parable of unseen power. History remembered her husband as the martyr general, but without her, his legacy might have faded into despair. She ensured that his memory became more than grief. It became a call to endurance. She transformed widowhood into leadership, sorrow into strength, memory into destiny. She was the torchbearer who passed on the flame, ensuring that Armenia's faith would not flicker out in the shadow of empire. And so, while chronicles speak of Vardan and Vahan, behind both figures stands the silent matriarch, Sahakanuysh. She lived in the margins of history but shaped its meaning. She held the torch when others faltered, passed it on when the time was right, and ensured that even in defeat, her people were already on the path to victory. Her story is a reminder that nations are not only built by warriors and kings, but by widows who refuse to let memory die, by mothers who teach faith to their children, by women who carry the flame through darkness until dawn returns. History often moves at a pace too slow for the living to see its arc. For those who survived the calamity of Avarayr, the decades that followed were years of humiliation and hardship. Persian governors tightened their grip, soldiers patrolled the valleys, and the fire altars of Zoroastrianism were pressed upon the people with renewed vigor. Many Armenians bent beneath the weight, some outwardly conforming, others hiding their faith in secret. Yet beneath the ashes embers smoldered, waiting for the breath of endurance to rekindle them. At the heart of that endurance was memory, and no one carried that memory more faithfully than Sahakanuysh. Her husband was gone, his body buried beneath the soil of Avarayr, his name spoken in hushed reverence. But in the households and churches of Armenia, his story lived on, carefully tended by those who had loved him. Sahakanuysh, in particular, ensured that his sacrifice was never framed as defeat. She refused to let the tale of Avarayr be told as annihilation. Instead, she shaped it into testimony, teaching her children, her kin, and the wider community that Vardan's death was not the end, but the beginning of a struggle that would one day bear fruit. The decades passed, and the children grew. Among them, Vardan Mamikonian rose into manhood, carrying the indelible mark of his uncle's martyrdom and his aunt's resilience. He had been too young to ride at Avarayr, but he had grown up in its shadow, tutored by the steady hand of Sahakanuysh. From her, he learned that leadership was not the pursuit of glory, but the acceptance of sacrifice. From her, he absorbed the conviction that faith was not negotiable, that it was the axis around which identity revolved. She had instilled in him not bitterness, but patience, not despair, but determination. He carried within himself both the fire of his uncle and the endurance of his aunt, a union of sword and memory. Persian rule continued to weigh heavily, but cracks appeared in the empire. External wars drained resources, internal factions weakened authority, and Armenia sensed that opportunity might return. When the time came, it was Vahan who rose to lead, rallying nobles and commoners alike. His revolt was not sudden, but the culmination of decades of quiet preparation. The fruit of seeds sown in kitchens and churches, in whispered hymns and clandestine prayers. And at the root of those seeds was Sahakanuysh, who had preserved the memory of sacrifice until it became the soil of renewed defiance. The campaigns of Vahan were fierce, marked by both victories and setbacks. But unlike before, the revolt did not collapse into despair. This time, the Armenians fought with the long memory of Avarayr burning in their hearts. They knew that their cause was not new, but the continuation of what their fathers had begun. They knew that every wound was part of a greater testimony. Vahan, leading with courage and wisdom, embodied the lessons he had absorbed in childhood. His commands carried the cadence of his uncle's bravery, but his patience and resilience bore the imprint of his aunt's influence. He led not only as a warrior, but as a custodian of memory, proving that leadership is sustained as much by what is remembered as by what is fought. Finally, in the year 484, Persia relented. Exhausted by other conflicts, pressured by the resilience of Armenian resistance, the Shah agreed to terms. The Treaty of Avarayr was signed, granting Armenians the right to worship freely, restoring privileges to the church, and acknowledging that the faith for which Vardan had died could no longer be suppressed. It was a political agreement, but for Armenians it was something more profound: the vindication of decades of sacrifice, the confirmation that their martyrs had not died in vain. The victory was not measured in territory or wealth, but in the survival of identity, in the right to remain themselves. For those who remembered Avarayr, the treaty was bittersweet. They celebrated, but they also wept, knowing that the triumph had been purchased at a terrible price. Sahakanuysh, now aged, perhaps lived to see the day, though history does not tell us with certainty. Whether alive in body or present only in the legacy she had cultivated, her influence was undeniable. The treaty was the culmination of her labor as much as of Vahan's campaigns. Without her guardianship of memory, without her steadfast shaping of the next generation, there would have been no revolt to conclude, no treaty to sign, no faith left to preserve. If she did live to witness it, one can imagine her standing in quiet dignity, her face lined with years of grief and endurance, her eyes reflecting both sorrow and peace. She would not have shouted in triumph or paraded in celebration. Instead, she would have bowed her head in prayer, offering thanks not for political victory, but for the vindication of faith. She would have remembered her husband lying on the field of Avarayr, his body broken but his cross unyielding, and she would have known that his sacrifice had borne fruit at last. Even if she did not live to see the treaty, her presence lingered in every clause, every word, every recognition of Armenia's right to be itself. The victory was not only Vahan's, it was hers, and through her, It belonged to all the widows and mothers who had preserved the soul of their people when armies could not. It was a victory beyond the grave, one that reached back to sanctify the dead and forward to secure the living. The legacy of Sahakanuysh thus became woven into the fabric of Armenia's survival. She was never crowned, never chronicled as a ruler, rarely even named in the annals of the age. Yet her influence was as real as the ink on the treaty. She had carried the torch when all seemed lost, passed it on when the next generation was ready, and ensured that faith outlived empire. Her life testified that victory is not always seen on battlefields, but in the unseen endurance of those who refuse to surrender memory. When Armenians told the story of their survival in the centuries that followed, they spoke of Vardan the martyr and Vahan the victor. But behind both stood the silent matriarch, the widow who bore grief without yielding to despair, the woman who transformed mourning into mission. Her victory was not measured in crowns or banners, but in the continuation of her people's faith. It was a victory that transcended death, a triumph beyond the grave. Time moves like water over stone. It erodes names, smooths memories, and carries the living into silence. For Armenia in the generations after Avarayr, the memory of that battlefield never vanished. It became the ground upon which identity stood, the story parents told their children, the song priests wove into liturgy. The wound that healed not by closing, but by becoming sacred. Vardan Mamikonian was remembered as the martyr general, the hero who had fallen with a cross in his hand. His nephew Vahan was remembered as the leader who secured the Treaty of Unsung, the victor who turned sacrifice into recognition. But somewhere behind the edges of these chronicles, another figure remained, Sahakanuysh, the widow who bore the burden of both. Her life faded into obscurity as the years passed. The chroniclers wrote of battles and treaties, of kings and bishops, of noble houses rising and falling. They had little room for the story of a woman who lived not in councils or on battlefields, but in the margins of endurance. Yet her influence endured in ways that words could not capture. It lived in the faith of children she raised, in the memory of prayers whispered in dark nights, in the resilience of a people who learned from her that grief can be transformed into strength. In her final years, she was no longer the central figure of councils or the steady presence in the halls of the Mamikonian estate. Younger leaders had taken their place, new alliances were forged, new battles prepared. Yet within the quiet spaces of her household, she continued her work. She prayed with the same devotion. She told the same stories. She guarded the same flame. Visitors who came to her did not find a figure of political power, but a woman whose very being carried the weight of history. They saw in her the widow of Vardan, the aunt of Vahan, the matriarch of survival. They left her presence not with orders, but with conviction, as if her silence spoke louder than commands. The landscape of Armenia bore witness to her life. The mountains that had echoed with the thunder of war now stood silent, their ridges crowned with monasteries and churches built in memory of the martyrs. Pilgrims walked to those sites, carrying with them the stories of Avarayr. Among their prayers, Sahakanuysh's presence lingered, even if her name was seldom spoken. She had become part of the unseen architecture of memory, a figure woven into the fabric of survival. When death came for her, it came without spectacle. No chronicler recorded the day, no scribe wrote the details. She passed quietly as she had lived, in the service of memory rather than in pursuit of glory. Yet in her passing, she left behind a legacy greater than crowns or monuments. She left a people who still bore the cross, a faith that had not been extinguished, a story that would be told for centuries. Her body may have been laid in the earth, but her influence was already sown in the souls of those who came after. The paradox of her life was that she remained invisible even as she shaped destiny. She was hidden behind the veil of widowhood, behind the titles of men, behind the silence of chronicles. Yet that very invisibility became her immortality. For in forgetting her name, history revealed her essence. The countless women who sustained nations without recognition, who bore grief in silence, who turned sorrow into survival. Sahakanuysh was one of them, but through her, all of them are remembered. Centuries later, when Armenians gathered to celebrate the feast of Vardan and his companions, when priests spoke of martyrs and children learned the story of Avarayr, Her presence was there, veiled but real. She was in the hymns that mothers sang to their children, in the resilience of widows who refused to abandon faith, in the silent strength of households that outlasted empires. She was not named, but she was everywhere. The story ends not with her voice, but with her silence. A silence that is not emptiness, but fullness, not erasure, but testimony. For in that silence lies the truth that nations are not preserved by heroes alone, but by those who carry memory when heroes fall. Sahakanuysh carried that memory across decades of grief, across years of oppression, across the fragile threshold between defeat and victory. She ensured that the cross remained in Armenian hands, that the flame never flickered out, that the story of Avarayr did not vanish into despair, but rose into eternity. And so the curtain falls with a paradox. She lived in obscurity, yet her life shaped a people. She was veiled in silence, yet her silence spoke more powerfully than words. She was remembered as the wife, yet without her, the husband's sacrifice would have been forgotten. Her invisibility is her immortality. The earth trembled on the day Vardan fell, but it endured because Sahakanuysh did not. She remained steadfast and silent until the torch passed beyond her hands. This is the lesson her life leaves for us, that history is not only made by those who hold the sword, but also by those who hold the memory. That victories are not only won on battlefields, but also in households where prayers are whispered and faith is preserved. That sometimes the greatest power lies not in what is seen, but in what is hidden. Sahakanuysh lived and died behind the veil, but through that veil she carried her people into survival. And it is in that hidden endurance that her immortality still breathes, eternal as the mountains of Armenia, eternal as the faith she preserved.